Hello fellow Greendale students, and welcome to an introspective analysis of one Craig Pelton, the dean of this ailing educational facility.
I can't count the reasons I should stay. One by one, they all just fade away.
Now, that was actually sort of a lie, because I'm not doing an analysis on the entirety of Dean Pelton, whose middle name I just discovered is Isidore, which actually kinda makes a lot of sense once you consider the character, that the middle name would be such a gender-available name. No, instead of exploring all that additional crap that Community throws out, what I want to talk about more specifically is the gender and sexuality of this happy pansexual imp, because the truth is far more complex than that, and it's actually something that I saw explored on TV for the first time in this show when I was a much younger, much more depressed person. See, many characters try to pin down who and what Craig Pelton is, whether he is gay, or whether he is definitively male, or whether he is a cross-dresser, or all of those labels that are useful for us to be able to understand someone because they can fit into the stereotyped boxes that we create for those labels within our minds. That gives us a frame of reference for that person by association with whatever group they might happen to belong to or be added to. In the show, people call him a fruit, which he proclaims is not the whole truth, a fact that reiterates itself over and over in the way that he views himself in correlation to others. The best episode for seeing this sexuality distinction in full plain view is that of Queer Studies in Advanced Waxing, where he is put on the spot by the school board to be a gay dean for them so that they can hopefully use it to deflect from their less than savoury expressions and attitudes and the controversy and scandal that makes them need to have some kind of tokenization so they can feel better about themselves or look better in the media's eye. Effectively using the queerness of the dean as a crutch, but they want him to be an explicit and easily understood version of queerness, because anything else complicates the message that they are okay with gay people. In response to this request over the course of the episode, which he tries to do for a while, but cannot keep it up forever as it feels stifling, he describes his sexuality like this.
But I'm not just gay.
What does that mean?
If coming out is a magic show and gayness is a rabbit out of a hat, I'm one of those never-ending handkerchiefs.
The sad truth, Craig, anything other than straight is plenty gay.
And this concept of sexuality, that it's a never-ending and forever-changing version of what could be and what matches an identity that is never set in stone, is reflected as well in the character choices that the dean makes with costumes. It would be far easier to see all the crazy and elaborate dress-ups that he does as a classical cross-dressing transvestite situation for a gay man, a very associated hobby with that community in mainstream straight cisgender society. I swear, you tell someone you are gay, and they will assume that you have an encyclopedic knowledge of RuPaul's Drag Race. But here that doesn't seem true. Dean Pelton is never playing a character, or even sticking with a singular outfit. It is much like their sexuality, an ever-changing and unpin-downable concept of identity expressed through the form of fashion and makeup. They are not characters that they are putting on for a show or to perform with. They are not fake layers of Dean Pelton over the true version. They are merely ways in which that free-flowing spirit that exists across a spectrum of labels is able to best express him/their selves. And another fascinating element of this as well is that at no point do we get the sense that Dean Pelton is ever willing to accept the labels of others, is not willing to become whatever box they need him to fill for their own interpretation of sexuality and gender to be maintained. I mean, of course, there's what I previously mentioned, but this brings us to the far more interesting episode that explores this from an angle that we don't often get considered or get represented so blatantly, with Britta's version of the ideal community TV show in the very last episode of the very last season. Yeah, I know, we have to go right to the very end to get this juicy and incredibly useful piece of information for analysing the gender and sexuality of this unplaceable figure, and if you haven't watched Community yet, I mean, it's on Netflix, or you can torrent it. I mean, it is 6 seasons, it's gonna take a while, but, you know, you could go do that. I'll wait, I can be here. I'll just sit here. See, in this episode, which is all about the gang coming to terms with endings and with the fact that people move on, they all get to pitch what they think the next season of the show would look like, how it matches up to their concepts and ideology of things. Britta, in the show, is the sort of classical, cynical and jaded activist, who views activism as a weird way of obtaining social superiority over others, while only secondarily considering it as, like, a good thing to do. It isn't the most favourable portrayal of an activist, but it is a somewhat accurate to some people version of what this person can be. A person who thinks of themselves as an ally of marginalised people, but is only doing it so they can feel better about themselves, and very often don't actually engage with the ideas of those they speak for and over. Britta as a representation of the modern white neoliberal, who wields minority struggles as a weapon for their own personal war with their inescapable privilege that they refuse to acknowledge or engage with in a meaningful way.
I can excuse racism, but I draw the line at animal cruelty.
You can excuse racism.
So, what?
Is in itself a whole ass video essay, and I'm not here making a brief look at Community, I'm just wanting to talk about Dean fucking Pelton, so let's get back on track. Also, if it comes down to it, I will make a brief look on Community. I will spend like 10 hours talking about Community, because I really like this show. It's not great, but I really like it still. Anyway, Britta's liberal quote, woke version of Community sees them sitting around a table with phones and calling people to tell them how bad they are, and also apparently, potentially at some point engaging in terrorism / telling everyone to be scared of how terrible the big bad world can be. It's like this attempt to showcase that this constant focus on negativity and constant focus on how terrible things are can just be boring to watch, and also isn't an interesting show in and of itself, and I get what it's trying to get at. I do think that Britta is often used too easily as a scapegoat, but yet again, not a brief look at Community, just Dean Pelton. And the interesting part, the part that we want to talk about, and we want to soak in, is when Dean Pelton comes into the room dressed in a hashtag girlboss skirt suit, who reminds me massively of a mix between Scully from X-Files and Denise from Twin Peaks. And isn't that a trans character that at some point I should probably talk about for the, 4 people who like Twin Peaks in the audience? But anyway, play the scene.
But let's talk about you for a second, though.
Well, I'm not a joke anymore. I'm strictly transgender. I'm not all this other stuff. I represent the transgender community, and it's a real thing. I am not crazy, but I do have flaws. I'm smart.
Now, this is really cool as a concept, and as a representation of what I think we might be able to recognise as a flaw that a lot of cisgender allies deal with, wherein they are okay with transgender people, but only as long as they fit an understood version of that community, and in Britta's case, one that best exemplifies her political goals for minorities, which is to not be a joke and to ditch all the other stuff in favour of being this monotone, politicised identity that represents a community in the blandest possible way so that it can appeal to the normalised vision of the majority. Dean Pelton's response to this is not one that denies this gender variance, though, and reinforces that position that I've stated on the character in that they are unplaceable. They have no problem with being presented as a trans woman. He merely takes issue with the way that Britta dismisses all that other stuff, the wacky and wild actions and dress and activities that he engages with as part of who he is. Because all of that other stuff is as much an element of his identity as anything else that others might assign, and nobody seems to really get that, or those that do seem to struggle with accepting it in the show. It's brilliant to see it portrayed because of how on the nose it is with the characters involved, who are so blunt as to make all themes on the nose automatically for the audience, because it gives us this clear idea of what gender and sexuality is to Dean Pelton, and it's one that I agree with as part of a reflection of our identities. It is one that more and more people are considering to be their own these days, with the rise of those who view their sexuality as just open, and their gender as, well, non-binary. Both of which are not boxes that we put people into, but open fields of the spectrum beyond the posts on either side of gay, straight, or man, woman. In the world of TV, we have a few characters these days on shows who do embrace that identity, who embrace that concept of themselves beyond such binary and bound ways of thinking. But in the ancient past of, like, the late 2000s and 2010s, many queer characters were just coming into being able to exist as what was expected and not be treated like freaks and weirdos in the narrative. Which is another area where I kind of like the character of Dean Pelton, in that he is a freaky little goblin dude, but he works it, and he incorporates it, and it's presented as a strange, fun thing that the character is existing as this, because that's what he sees himself as being happiest doing. And more queer stuff should be silly and wacky in the mainstream, rather than all of these somber, serious portrayals that try to represent the community in a sincere way, but end up looking like played-up versions of what cisgender and straight people want us to be to fit into society, or dark stories to make straight or cisgender people feel better about themselves because they're nodding along and going, yeah, wow, trans people have it so bad. Look at this character who's dealing with all this, all these problems. Wow, God. Poor trans people. I feel so much pity for them. Anyway, moving on to my next show, because that's not an attitude that I like to see used to encompass all trans people. Much like the mature transgender woman that Britta wants the Dean to become, rather than the unbound flailing child that he basically is. Because within our community, both of those examples do exist, but neither is the better representation of us. Neither is the more accurate or the more honest version of the trans community. Much like the Dean himself, queer people and the spectrums that we exist embody so much more than just what one label or one person can hope to encapsulate. Dean Pelton is an interesting character to consider from a queer perspective, especially existing as one who comes off as unwilling and okay with the fact that who they are, their sexuality and their gender, is forever in a flux state that will never probably be finalised, no matter how much it would be easier for others and easier for society for them to just be one thing. It speaks to a lot of the modern ways in which we think of queer theory, of gender as a performance that we participate in as much as it reflects us, of sexuality as a method by which you should see yourself, and not just your relation to others. While the character may not have become an icon for queer people, may not fly any flag except for the universal nature of queerness, I hope that we can see the flexibility of our community in them though, that should not define itself by a singular label or create more boundaries within a character who accepted none of those for themselves at any point during the show, and persistently alluded to the deeper depths of character that go on beneath the base ideas that others may form about them. And I would be lying, and also missing an opportunity to add a few minutes, if I said that this was not something that spoke to me personally. While I might tell people like family or friends or dating partners that I am an ace trans woman, when it comes to how I personally view my gender and sexuality, I don't think it's so ironclad. There is always flexibility around those concepts and around how I view myself. As Cooney puts it, there is all that other stuff that I like to do or engage with that might not so easily fall into the way that outsiders would think of ace or trans women. And while that doesn't negate those labels as being kind of accurate, they are far from the whole truth. There are depths that I haven't even probably considered going on that I am sure I will find out about when I am older, and randomly thinking about them someday, and all that might be true for you as well. In which case, like Dean Pelton, you don't need to rush it. You don't need to embrace those labels or take on those labels if you don't think that they're the perfect match for you. Sure, maybe other people aren't going to be able to understand it immediately because they won't get how someone can have that label but also have this label, or be that label but also be other things. But you're not living for other people. You're living for yourself. You don't need to scramble to find those labels, as the best thing you can do is to be yourself and continue being yourself as that identity evolves and changes over time and over understanding. That's a surprisingly positive message to come out of a TV show sitcom for trans people. Normally we just get mocked or called the T word. Hopefully I've given you something to think about here, or maybe inspired some ideas or a desire to consider a few concepts, because these short videos are all about that for me. I am not trying to definitively answer anything, I'm just trying to get a ball rolling or hash out some stuff that has been going over in my head. If you did like it or connected with anything, then please consider liking, sharing, commenting, running up to random people in the street and screaming, "I have seen a new video, and thou must see it too, lest I split ye in twain." You know, the classic YouTube stuff. Otherwise, if you would like to financially support me in my current interest of trying to work out what the hell was going on in Twilight, you can check out my Patreon or Ko-Fi link, both in the description, and both massively useful for helping me to stay alive. Look, all of these names currently flying past are people who helped to make this channel happen, and to continue happening, and you could be on there too, if you wanted to. Anyway, thanks for watching the video, and I hope that you have a great day.